It's my great pleasure to introduce Os Guinness.
You may have noticed that the first three speakers have been, at least were, once British. And certainly this one still is. Now you can imagine, speaking a lot as I do on American things in this country, I'm often asked why on earth I do that. Sometimes I remind people of the story of Winston Churchill in Williamsburg. And the Prime Minister is being shown around Williamsburg, and the guide was waxing enthusiastic about it and suddenly realized the significance of what she was saying. And she stopped mid-sentence and said, I feel rather embarrassed to be showing you the cradle of the revolution against the English. Churchill snorted. Revolution against the English, he said. They were Englishmen with English ideas fighting a German king with his German mercenaries. Now, if you understand the historical significance of that, that's why many of us who are English and admirers of this country feel very comfortable, because in many ways English ideas have come into their own magnificently here. When the religious right, or the Christian right, began to get going, I was in England, and actually was one of the first in the secular media to cover it with a documentary on the rise of the religious right for the BBC. I wouldn't say I told you so, but certainly many of the things which David said this morning, or Paul said at lunch, were things that many of us have seen for a long, long, long time. For myself, I put it often in three simple ways. First, you could see that there was theological unfaithfulness. Second, you could see that there would be political ineffectiveness. But thirdly, what we didn't foresee, and is clear now, is that there would be a cultural counterproductiveness. More of that tomorrow night. The religious right, Christian right, is one of the main factors stoking anti-religious, anti-Christian sentiment, the like of which Europe has known for centuries, but America has not. And unless this is solved, it will be fateful for the gospel in this country, and it will be fateful for the American Republic. But in this particular talk, I want to speak about freedom. And I must admit, what prompted this was not 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It was listening to evangelicals enthusiastic about much of the recent talk of freedom, which actually came from foreigners like Natan Sharansky or from neoconservatives, and in many ways were not deeply thought through Christian ideas of freedom. And I'm thinking in particular of the second inaugural, with its promise of freedom sweeping the world, ending tyranny, and ridding the world of evil. And as some non-evangelical thinkers said at the time, you had notes in that which were utopian, profoundly un-Christian. And that was when I first began to put together some of the things that I want to share this afternoon. But as you can see, I'm doing it as an Englishman. I think when you understand what the framers were trying to do, you have first probably the most daring part of the American Revolution. You have secondly one of the most neglected parts of what the framers were trying to do in terms of today's understanding, and you have an area where many Christians are most uncritical. And that's why I want to tackle it. But let me begin with a story of, there was a time in 1843 when a young Massachusetts scholar, 21 years old, was trying to track down every veteran of the Revolutionary Wars. And he came across an old gentleman called Captain Levi Preston, 70 years his senior, 91. Very hunched over, but he'd been a veteran of both Lexington and Concord. And the researcher came up to him and said, Captain Preston, why did you go out to fight? And the old boy was startled that anyone would ask such an obvious question, and he just looked at the young man. And then he drew himself up to his full height. And the researcher said, well, you were going out to face oppressions, weren't you? We weren't oppressed, the old boy growled. What about the Stamp Act? Never saw the Stamp Act. Well, how about the tea duty. Never drank a drop of the stuff, he said. The boys threw it in the harbor before I got there. And the researcher was getting increasingly frustrated, and he said, well, surely you've been reading books like Sidney and Harrington and Locke. Never read a page of them, he said. All we had was the Bible and the Catechism, Isaac Watts's hymns, and an old almanac. By that stage, the researcher was really puzzled, and he said, well, tell me why you did go out to fight. Very simple, the old boy said. We had always been free, and we intended to be free always. Always free, free always. That was by an uneducated man. But if you see that same theme picked up by generals like Nathaniel Greene or many of the framers and founders, if you think of it, that is the most daring goal of the revolution. That you could create a free society which could stay free forever. Now, if you think for a second, freedom never ever lasts. And there are various obvious ways in which freedom is undermined. Freedom, for instance, spirals down to license and permissiveness. Or freedom hardens, because free people like to be secure, and so they guard their freedom in ways that undermine freedom. You know the bumper sticker today, one nation under surveillance. America now, post 9/11, has a desire for security that would have been the envy of most dictators in history, all in the name of freedom. Or again, free people often promote freedom in ways that contradict freedom. And you can see in your own history how freedom becomes self-legitimating, self-evident. If it's done for freedom, it must be right, including waterboarding or whatever. The fact is, freedom is always undermined in the end, and yet, were they utopian or were they realistic? The framers deeply believed that what they were about was creating a free republic that could stay free. Now let me unpack some of the thinking behind this and bring their thinking right down to our discussion today. And of course, if any of this is right, or the framers were right, we have some very urgent public arguments to make. Firstly, think of the tasks of establishing a free republic. There were three obvious tasks involved in it, but we concentrate on the first, maybe the second, and we ignore the third, which is actually our task. The first task for the framers, and with any country that's gone through this, it's obviously first and foremost, winning freedom. That's 1776. That's the revolution. But remember, the French did it, 1789. The Russians did it, 1917. Winning freedom is not unique. Although, of course, no nation in history has made so much of its winning of freedom, and now symbols like the flag and toasts and days like July the 4th, and so on. The second task is actually harder. Ordering freedom. Giving it a political, moral, cultural framework in which it can thrive. And that, of course, is not 1776, it's 1787, the Constitution. The ordering of freedom, and the first articles were a failure, and the second were quite extraordinary. Now there, of course, the French didn't do it. The Russians didn't do it. Their revolutions spiraled down to demonic disorder, and what followed them was worse than what preceded them. The Reign of Terror in France being the symbol before Auschwitz of Europe's worst evil, when millions were killed in the Vendée, let alone in the bloody excesses of the guillotine itself. Ordering freedom, the framers did it. But the third task, and they understood this well, is actually by far the hardest: sustaining freedom. The first, a few years; the second, 13 years, the Constitution. But sustaining freedom is the work not of decades, but of centuries. Now, America's 230 years old today. That's actually half the age of Rome before we got to Caesar Augustus, and then there were many centuries after that. You've hardly begun. And the framers speak of a freedom that could be not only won and ordered, but sustained. And that one's overlooked. And of course, that one is our generation's challenge, which is the exact moment not to overlook it. Now, the second thing to go on is to see that the framers talked like that against a backdrop of what they knew were the menaces to any political system surviving, let alone a free one. We celebrate the framers as revolutionary, and they were. But they were also rooted. They used history in order to defy history, because they knew that the lesson of history was that freedom, like any political order, did not last. And so they explored the classics, Cicero, Polybius, many others, to see why no political system lasted. And there were three classical menaces to freedom that were in the back of their minds. The first is probably the only one we think of today, and yet they didn't, which was external menaces. In other words, a nation can suddenly find itself with a hostile nation, bigger, better armed, whatever, than itself, and it's in trouble. And that's true of many of the great powers in history as their time came. But for the framers, that obviously wasn't the number one problem. Most of them came from a small protected island, Britain, and they now lived on a large protected continent with two huge natural buffers in the oceans, and they lived a long, long way from any serious enemy and had a very weak and defenseless native population to deal with. And you can see in the framers, you can see in Abraham Lincoln, for instance, Lincoln, in his great speech at the Lyceum in 1828, he poo-poos the idea that any, quote, transatlantic Napoleon, transatlantic Bonaparte, he says, could put his foot down in the cornfields of Ohio. That, of course, was then. Now, intercontinental ballistic missiles, the internet, and all sorts of other things, we have 9/11, and we have to take external menaces very, very seriously, which was the significance of 9/11, that it punctured that illusion of invulnerability which really characterizes America from the early framers. External menaces to them weren't a challenge. The second one was much deeper, and we ignore that. It's what Polybius, the Greek historian, calls the corruption of customs. His thinking is worth wrestling with. Polybius says, and his first point is enough to make Americans nod off. He says what's decisive for any nation is its constitution. And immediately Americans say, we've got the best, all is over. No, no, said Polybius. What's decisive is its constitution, but constitutions rest on a bedding of customs, traditions, moral standards. And over time, some customs will stay what he calls desirable and reinforce the Constitution. Other customs will become what he calls objectionable, and they will undermine the Constitution. So the Constitution, the fundamental rule of law, alone is never enough. It needs what Tocqueville later called, and David referred to this morning, the habits of the heart. If there's a corruption of customs, the best constitution in the world can't hold it together. And the framers were very, very aware of that. The third classical menace, in one word, was time. The passing of time. We would say, as followers of Jesus, the presence of sin and the passing of time. But in a fallen world, nothing ever lasts forever. This too shall pass. You probably know the very year of the Constitution and the Philadelphia Miracle, so-called, was the year that Edward Gibbon published the last volume of The Decline and Fall of Rome. And if you read the classic, his last chapter begins, why did Rome fall? This fall beyond belief after 800 years. And his first answer, the injuries of time. And he says he got the idea for the book because when he went to Rome, he saw grass growing and cattle grazing where the senators and the emperors had deliberated. The passing of time. Now, you do have that in the framers, and certainly you have that in Lincoln. If you read this Lyceum speech I mentioned, he talks about the silent artilleries of time undoing what the revolutionary generation built in. very rare notion today, anyone speaking of that. But of course, if you think, for the framers, after dominance, there is only one stage: decline. And yet at the time of dominance, almost no Americans are thinking of the framers' understanding of the passing of time. Cicero speaks of things that are revolutionary becoming routine because of time. Things that are fresh becoming faded and antique because of time. And the framers had a very realistic view of time, and surprisingly, the Enlightenment, with all its optimism, had a remarkable sense of time flowing and years passing, unlike our own. On to the third point: how did they set up a system that could try and beat the odds? I first came here in '68. It's always surprised me in academic discussion that when you tackle a problem like this, most scholars, and certainly most ordinary people, give an answer: how did the framers think they'd resist the collapse of political systems and the decline of freedom? They answer in one word: the Constitution. And they ignore what is actually the other half of the framers' answer. Yes, the Constitution and the Federalist Papers are a magnificent tribute to what they understood by arguing for the Constitution, but they did not believe in parchment barriers alone. And the Constitution, as Madison put it, was not a faultless work. Now, there's no name for the other part, so I'll give you my name. I call it this. This wasn't their name. I call it the Golden Triangle of Freedom. And as historians like Bernard Bailyn point out, it is so central and clear and strong in the framers, it's startling that people don't take it more seriously. But today they don't. What is this golden triangle of freedom? My word again, that offsetting and balancing the Constitution. You can put it very simply: the idea that freedom requires virtue, the first leg. That virtue requires faith of some sort. And the faith of any sort requires freedom. And like a recycling triangle, that goes on round and round ad infinitum. Freedom requires virtue. Virtue requires faith. Faith requires freedom, which requires virtue, etc., etc., etc. And this, of course, underlies much of what David was saying this morning about obedience to the unenforceable. John Adams: only a virtuous people are capable of freedom, because freedom is that habit of the heart, the obedience of the unenforceable, and so on and so on. But virtue requires faith. Now, Governor Romney in his speech went missing out that stage. Freedom requires religion, which of course hits the secularists right between the eyes and is not what the framers argued. Freedom, they said, requires virtue, and for most people it is faith that supplies the virtue. And if you think, what best inspires virtue? What best describes the content of virtue? And what speaks of the sanctions of people who are not virtuous? Well, clearly, it's matters of faith. And while people like Christopher Hitchens rightly point out, there are many noble atheist individuals. To this point, atheism has signally failed in providing a nationwide cultural legitimation for virtue that is grounded in a secularist ethic. But of course, the third leg of the triangle is the most original. People say, what about the separation of powers? That wasn't original. Montesquieu argued for it. The British had it to some extent. You can trace some of that back to the Old Testament. Certainly Switzerland had it centuries before the United States. But what's absolutely unique is the First Amendment. That faith required freedom. It must be voluntary, based in freedom of conscience and religious liberty. That is unique. And the first 16 words of the First Amendment are actually the most decisively different, the unique part of the Constitution. What are the legacies of the way they set that up? Let me just mention two here because of time. First, vitality. American vitality. Now again, that's against the current. If you ask most Americans, certainly scholars, what's behind American vitality, they'd say things like freedom and free market enterprise. But if you think, the free market, modern free market capitalism, came in several decades after the First Amendment, 1791. Yet the First Amendment prefigures free market capitalism in an extraordinary way. What the economists call demonopolization in business is actually the equivalent to what the First Amendment does in disestablishment. A level playing field is the equivalent of religious equality for all. And you can see the effect of that. The first part of the 19th century was called the evangelical century because who flourished under those conditions? If everything depends on the beliefs and the believers and their generosity and their enterprise and their sacrifice, who were the most entrepreneurial? Not the established churches, but the evangelicals. And the explosion of the educational movement. The answering of a flowering of charitable response, and of course the great reforms climaxing in abolition, all of them rooted in that social entrepreneurialism that itself was rooted in the religious entrepreneurialism that owed a great deal to faith under the conditions of the First Amendment. Some of you may disagree strongly with what I'm going to say now, but I believe that's why the president's faith-based initiatives are quite wrong-headed. What he's trying to do is laudable. Release once again that entrepreneurialism. But he's actually doing it exactly the opposite way that it was done first. It was when the faith communities were freed from government dependency, left on their own, that they most flourished and were most influential. And the more the faith communities are encouraged to put their noses back in Uncle Sam's trough, on the one hand, you'll see a growing secularization because the government can't support many of the things that make them powerful in their ministries. And on the other hand, you have a growing sense of dependency on red tape and government largesse and so on and so on. Laudable in its aims, but entirely wrong-headed in the way it's going about it. The second thing you can see, and I'll crisscross the same points for a different reason tomorrow night, is that you can see this creates enormous social harmony despite the liberty and the diversity. Again, you Americans take your relative harmony for granted. But any of us who come from other parts of the world, I come from Southern Ireland. Everything that's gone on in the north of Ireland, you know the tragic counterexamples. But what you see here is the American system brings two things together which usually contradict each other, but here they complement each other. Passionate religious convictions with strong political civility. Now again, I said you Americans yawn, that's so obvious. Now we've got to recognize there have been egregious violations. Take the Know-Nothing movement, the nativism, the anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish discrimination, and so on. But for all that, I would argue that the framers who got race so badly wrong at the start, and who got the women badly wrong at the start, got religious liberty almost perfectly right at the start, and you have this amazing system that no other country with so much liberty and so much diversity has achieved. And to test that, you only look elsewhere in the world. As a Western European, until the new immigrants arrived from the Commonwealth or from the Middle East, Western Europe in the last 50 years was remarkably civil about religion. But all of you been to Europe, you'd say in your heart, big deal. There's no religion to be uncivil about. Go to Minnesota and the church-going is still in the 70%, way above the American average. Go to Sweden, where many of the Minnesotans come from, church-going is 3%. 3% go to church, they're not going to fight about it in public. And you can see much of European civility has been unrealistic because there was no diversity of faiths. The Middle East is the opposite problem. Passionate religious convictions, no civility, no liberty, no life. And day by day we've seen the ghastly consequences of that. In many ways, the brilliant way the First Amendment ordered religion, liberty, and diversity in public life underlies much of the greatness of this country. But of course, we're not there today. If you hurry the story down to where we are now, and you could tell it many ways, let me just mention 3 shifts that make the framers' understanding impossible. The first, referred to already, David's talk, the privatization of religion. If religion, under the impact of modernity, becomes privately engaging, publicly irrelevant, it simply cannot be the salt and the light, let alone the cultural influence that the framers' understanding reckon on it being. A privatized religion cannot do it. Now, of course, we have to say as followers of Jesus, a privatized religion, which in practice denies the lordship of Christ over the whole of life, is theologically unfaithful. That's the real problem. But I'm just talking about the cultural impact. The privatization of religion simply cannot do the job that the framers' understanding of religion saw that it should do. Now, that happened long before there was an ACLU or Americans United for the Separation of Church and State or the Everson case or any of these things. In other words, the rot happened within our circles before we had any serious opposition. Let's not talk like John Whitehead did of the stealing of America. That's nonsense. We really have to talk about the surrendering of America. Faith was undermined before it had any serious public opposition in that way. The second huge change is the rise of what I'll loosely call proceduralism, sometimes called legal secularism. By that I'm thinking of the philosophy made popular by John Rawls at Harvard, or Jürgen Habermas in Europe, that the public square is a neutral sphere of competing interests, and faith is inviolably private and has no part. So faith, character, and virtue are private only. Many people have not read Rawls or read Habermas, but that idea is very, very powerful. You think of the Clinton impeachment, and the intellectuals who wrote the letter to the New York Times and the Washington Post saying, in effect, the president may have the morals of an alley cat, but that's irrelevant. Why? Because faith, character, and virtue are private. The public square is a neutral sphere of competing self-interest in which what the framers saw as fundamental, the golden triangle of freedom, faith, character, and virtue, and so on, was utterly irrelevant. And that is very powerful, although under assault today, not only from people like us who object to it, it's highly illiberal, it's also under assault in philosophical circles, fortunately. The third effect is the most recent, and that's the rise of postmodernism. In other words, there is no such thing as objective faith or character or virtue. It is all a mask for the real agenda, which is power. Power. If any of you read Philip Brief's extraordinary book, My Life Among the Death Works, he argues we've shifted from, leaving out the first category he uses, we've shifted from a faith-directed culture where beliefs underlay our culture and they had compelling power, as he puts it, to a fiction-directed culture where everything now is different than what it appears, and everything's a matter of the will to power dressed up in one agenda or another. So the framers, it wasn't just they got race wrong, but they were dead white European males who had their plantation owners' interests, etc., etc., the real issue with power. So Martin Luther King would argue that the Declaration of Independence is a promissory note. The framers, tragically argued, didn't cash it in for the slaves. They were wrong. That was evil. It was a contradiction, but it was a promissory note which now could be cashed in. Whereas our postmodern radicals, the whole thing was hypocrisy, and we should throw them out, baby, bathwater, and all. In other words, in many intellectual circles in this country, you don't have the philosophical or cultural climate in which the framers' understanding could even get a hearing, let alone could be carried on. Which brings me to my last serious point, the contemporary menaces to sustaining freedom. The contemporary menaces. The first is an alienation of leaders. Many people have addressed this, Samuel Huntington, Christopher Lasch, and many, many others. But you've got many of the thought leaders of this country who are out of line with the ideas that the framers had. Some are just ignorant. Some are opposed. Some are hostile. But it clearly raises the question, can a great nation, can a great civilization endure if a sufficient number of its thought leaders and intelligentsia are either ignorant or opposed to what made it great? And America is reaching that stage today. The second contemporary menace is a breakdown in the transmission of American virtues. What do I mean? Tocqueville, Jefferson, some conservatives, some liberal like Jefferson, all agreed that America is in the business of a constant ongoing transmission in a double sense. There is always a transmission from the older generation to the younger generation. And we call that public education. Now, the public schools weren't just free universal education. They were free universal education that taught American virtues and American ideals to provide the unum that balanced the pluribus, so that was not only a motto, but an accomplishment. Now, I find it curious that many Christians who rightly say there's a crisis in public education tend to dismiss the public schools as if there's a crisis, let's get out. But the public schools can't be dismissed lightly because they're so important as custodians of handing on the American ideals and the American virtues. That's the first transmission. Clearly, in the last 50 years, that is no longer functioning well. The other transmission is from the old-timers, because no one's really native here, to the newcomers. And that, of course, is not education, but immigration. Now, the irony is that when there was tight controls after World War I, right down to 1965, there was also a heavy insistence on citizenship education. Then in 1965, when the open door policy increasingly came in, there was an almost complete relaxing of any requirement for citizenship education. And even today, with all the immigration discussion of borders or the economic business interests and so on, one of the missing elements which would have been there in the past was that whoever is allowed in legally and welcomed as citizens should be taught and come to understand what it is to be American. But as one historian says today, it's relatively easy to be an American. Get your naturalization papers. Increasingly difficult to know what it is to be American. But if that is eventually lost, the transmission both in education and in immigration will have broken down, and eventually the unum will be overwhelmed by the pluribus, and much of the genius of this country will be in trouble. The third contemporary menace is the corruption of customs, and I'm deliberately using Polybius' word. Just think, and I needn't belabor that in a group like this, just think how many things are now contentious in the culture wars, which until the 1960s would have been self-evident to all Americans. Left, right, Democrat, Republican, life, family. Is there such a thing as truth? Does character matter in leadership? Most Americans would have said, of course, of course, of course, of course. And yet each one of those things today, and many more, is under clear assault in some section of this country. And clearly the United States, in one way or another, is experiencing a very profound notion of the corruption of customs. Now, there are many ways people respond to this. If they take seriously that the framers did call for a freedom that could last, in the way I described, people say things like, well, they were children of their time, and they were religious in those days, but we're not today. But that doesn't wash, because, you know, the framers were Republican and pro-religious at a time when all the world's Republicans were anti-religious. Republicans, the small r. Think of the French Revolution and so on. The framers were stubbornly, consciously, deliberately out of step by being Republican and pro-religious. It wasn't simply that they were children of their time. Or you can say, as many others do, well, they thought you relied on character and virtue and faith and these things. We have other things in the 20th century in our more liberal secular era to rely on. It sounds fine until you press them what they are, and usually there are two candidates. One is law. Again, as David said, if it's only law, without the golden triangle, you'll have endless law and endless litigiousness. The other, of course, is technology. The old dream of a society so perfect that no one can afford to be evil and so on, but we know what that leads to, constant surveillance through technology until we actually lose our freedom. Press people to say what really replaces what the framers put up, and people often don't have an answer, which means how do they see that freedom will endure? Now, the fact is, if you examine contemporary freedom, for instance, the bias towards negative freedom, freedom from, rather than freedom for excellence, and so on. The very historic discussion of freedom is itself deeply lopsided today. It's not my argument this afternoon, but I would argue that just as the Civil War was described by Lincoln as a freedom war, negative freedom being the Southern view, positive freedom being the Northern view, so the culture wars are actually freedom wars. Now, the trouble is that many of us on the Jewish and Christian and traditional side are actually ourselves deeply riddled with views that are modern and secular in other forms. In other words, we're going into this battle deeply riddled ourselves. But you can see that what's at stake today is freedom. Now, America has many other problems. You can look at the international challenges. You can look at the economic challenges. You can look at immigration. You can look at education. You can look at healthcare. There's all sorts of things. But I would argue when you put all those other problems in perspective, and they should be, America's deepest problem today is a crisis of freedom. And the freedom that Americans are trying to live now simply cannot last. A friend of mine was next to a Middle Eastern ambassador when the second inaugural was being given. And the Middle Eastern ambassador, who was an Arab, just turned to my friend and said, every time President Bush says freedom, what I see is license. And that's from an outsider. If you look at the framers, one of the curious discussions they have, and I'll draw it to conclude with this, they did understand the Jewish and Christian cycles. So just as the Puritans saw that the Christian equivalent of the Exodus was conversion, so the framers secularized that and nationalized that, which of course makes it weak. Their equivalent was revolution. Just as the Puritans understood that their equivalent of the Hebrew covenant was in fact covenant, so the framers understood that their political national equivalent was constitution. That one's relatively commonly said. But what's often forgotten is that just as the Jews believed in what's called in the Old Testament a return, so the Puritans, of course, and many other Christians too, believed in revival and an awakening sent by God to return his people to him. Curiously, you do see hints of some of the framers realized there needed to be an American equivalent to those things. George Mason, Anglican and conservative politically, spoke of the need for a frequent recurrence to fundamental first principles. Unless there was constantly a going back, we'd be in trouble. Jefferson, who was no conservative, much more liberal, he spoke of a revolution every 20 years. And in his much more wild and radical and utopian ways, he realized too that every generation had to reappropriate the principles or they would be in trouble. Tocqueville put it like this. You know what an admirer of American democracy was and how sad he was by watching his own French Revolution turn out so badly. And in one of his last writings, he said this, with a revolution, as with a novel, the hardest part to invent is the ending. By any standards in history, there's never been a generation like your American founders. There may have been individuals in the past who were as great or greater, but never a generation of them. Your first chapter is brilliant. With all its weaknesses, it is brilliant and daring, and nothing more daring than can a free people stay free forever. Your generation has abandoned their idea. Can you do better? Or do we have to make a public argument as Christians for a much more profound understanding of what they were trying to say and what needs to happen today? This generation is actually of extraordinary, crucial significance. There are things that this generation has got to get right, or the American Republic will decline within a generation.
Trinity, by God's grace, forming students to transform the world through Christ.